At 6:15 p.m. on October 14, 2025, the state of Florida declared Samuel Lee Smithers, sometimes called the Deacon of Death, dead by lethal injection. But long before the prison doors closed, he was known by another name, Brother Sam, the church deacon who mowed lawns, led prayers, and hid a terrible secret. Behind the hymns and Sunday smiles was a man capable of unimaginable darkness, a man who drowned the very faith he preached in a pond just outside Plant City. Today, we uncover how a trusted servant of God became one of Florida's most haunting killers, and the two young women whose lives ended far too soon. When the water finally gave up its secrets, justice began to stir. But what really happened in that pond? Please like this video, share, and subscribe for more true crime stories that reveal the truth behind the headlines and the darkness behind the mask. Samuel Lee Smithers was born on January 30, 1953, in rural Tennessee. Those who knew him described a childhood overshadowed by pain, violence, and instability. According to family members, Smithers' early years were marked by a series of traumatic incidents. One relative claimed he had been dropped on his head as a baby, while another recounted that he was once struck in the head with a shotgun during a robbery. But the physical injuries were only part of the story. Emotional scars ran deeper. In court testimony, one of Smithers' brothers revealed disturbing details about their upbringing. Their father was violently abusive, often taking out his rage on their mother. Their mother, meanwhile, was described as a deeply religious woman, but her beliefs took a darker turn. She reportedly subjected her children to exorcism-type beatings, claiming she was driving out evil spirits. These early experiences of fear, confusion, and violence would shape much of Smithers' psychological makeup, and perhaps foreshadow the volatility that lay ahead. By the early 1970s, Smithers appeared to have found stability. Between 1973 and 1979, he married a woman named Sharon, and together they had a son. To neighbors and church members, Smithers seemed like a man who had overcome a difficult past. He worked steadily, became a respected member of his community, and even rose to the position of deacon and custodian at the First Baptist Church in Plant City, Florida. To many, he was the picture of a quiet, church-going family man, someone who prayed with others, volunteered, and helped maintain the church grounds. But beneath that calm surface, something was unraveling. A year before the murders that would make his name infamous, cracks began to show in Smithers' carefully built image. In 1995, he abruptly resigned from his position at the church under troubling circumstances. He had been accused of plotting to falsify a woman's community service records in exchange for sexual favors. The allegation sent shockwaves through the congregation. Smithers denied the claims, but the damage was done. His once clean reputation was tarnished, and whispers began to circulate about the man who had once been trusted with the keys to God's house. What no one realized then was that this quiet fall from grace was only the beginning, a prelude to the dark spiral that would lead to two brutal murders and, eventually, death row. By the time Samuel Lee Smithers turned 27, the cracks in his carefully composed exterior had become fault lines. Behind the calm, church-going image was a man wrestling with impulses he couldn't explain or control. It began with fire. In what seemed like an unthinkable betrayal of faith, Smithers, a man raised on sermons and scripture, became obsessed with burning churches. In the late 1970s, he and two other men were arrested after setting a church ablaze with kerosene. When investigators confronted him, he appeared disturbingly calm, even cooperative. But what came next was even more chilling. Just weeks later, Smithers returned to the same church, sneaking into the classroom area and setting another fire, this time alone. The flames tore through the walls where Sunday school children once learned about God and goodness. And when questioned, Smithers made a confession that left even seasoned detectives uneasy. "The excitement," he said, "gave me an erection." It was a disturbing glimpse into the mind of a man whose sense of morality had twisted into something unrecognizable, where destruction brought pleasure and chaos brought calm. But the fire didn't stop there. In yet another incident, Smithers targeted a woman's car, setting it ablaze outside her home. Then, in a bizarre and almost performative act, he knocked on her door to warn her that her car was on fire, a fire he had started himself. He even brought along a fire extinguisher, playing the part of the rescuer in a crisis of his own making. When he was finally arrested, Smithers confessed to all three arsons. He told police he didn't fully understand why he did it, only that it made him feel like a hero. It was as if Smithers lived in two worlds, the devout deacon and the secret destroyer, the man of the church and the man who burned it down. And so the question lingers, a haunting one. Was Samuel Lee Smithers born with darkness inside him, or did years of pain, violence, and faith twisted by fear create the monster he would become? By the spring of 1996, Samuel Lee Smithers was a man living two lives. To his neighbors, he was still the soft-spoken church custodian, a husband, and a father. But behind closed doors, his carefully built image of faith and normalcy had begun to crumble. On the night of May 12, 1996, that facade shattered completely. That evening, Smithers met 24-year-old Denise Elaine Roach at a small, rundown motel in Tampa, a place known to locals for drugs and prostitution. Roach, originally from Jamaica, had been struggling to get her life back on track. She was the mother of 2 young children, trying to survive the streets that had offered her little mercy. Smithers, who knew the motel well, approached her under the cover of night. He offered her money in exchange for sex, and she agreed. What seemed like a routine encounter would soon turn into a night of horror. After leaving the motel, Smithers drove Roach to a 27-acre rural property in Plant City, a quiet, wooded area owned by one of his acquaintances. To anyone passing by, it was just another patch of Florida farmland, but for Denise Roach, it would become the place where her life ended. What happened next would later be pieced together through Smithers' own confession and the grim evidence left behind. Once at the property, Smithers brutally attacked Roach. He beat her, then strangled her with his bare hands. The violence was sudden and vicious, far from the accident he would later describe. When it was over, he dragged her lifeless body to a nearby pond, submerging it beneath the murky water and leaving it to sink into the mud and darkness. For days, no one knew where Denise had gone. To the world, she simply vanished. But when investigators finally brought Smithers in, he offered a story that seemed designed to excuse the inexcusable. In his police statement, Smithers claimed that Denise's death was an accident, that she had trespassed on the property days earlier and refused to leave. According to him, a scuffle broke out, and as he shoved her, a piece of wood fell from a shelf and struck her head, killing her instantly. "I didn't mean to hurt her," he told detectives. "It just happened." But detectives weren't convinced. His account didn't match the evidence or the brutality of her injuries. The idea that a young woman could die instantly from a falling plank seemed almost impossible. And then there was something even darker, a chilling echo of his earlier obsession with destruction and control. He had returned to the scene, weighted her body, and dumped it in the pond, as if trying to erase her existence completely. For Denise Roach's 2 children, their mother's life had ended in silence, her story hidden beneath the still waters of a Florida pond. For Samuel Lee Smithers, the act would mark a point of no return. He claimed it was an accident. But was it? Or was it the beginning of a pattern? The moment when the man who once burned churches turned his violence on human life itself? 2 weeks after the death of Denise Elaine Roach, the quiet community of Plant City, Florida was about to be shaken again, by the same man, on the same lonely stretch of land. On May 28, 1996, 31-year-old Christy Elizabeth Cowan crossed paths with Samuel Lee Smithers. Like Roach before her, she met him at a local motel in Tampa, where she was known to work as a sex worker to survive. Smithers paid her for sex, just as he had done with Denise. To the outside world, it might have looked like another fleeting encounter, but for Christy Cowan, it would become her final night alive. Smithers drove her to the same 27-acre property in rural Plant City, an area surrounded by thick trees and still ponds, secluded, silent, and far from any watchful eyes. What happened next followed a disturbingly similar pattern. Once there, Smithers attacked Cowan, beating her before strangling her. But this time, his violence escalated even further. Investigators would later determine that he also wielded an axe, striking Christy in a moment of uncontrolled rage. When the horror was over, Smithers dragged her body to the same pond where he had hidden Denise Roach just weeks earlier, submerging another victim beneath the water, in the very same spot. 2 women. Same place. Same fate. But when questioned by police, Smithers spun a very different story, one meant to paint himself as a man caught in circumstance rather than a killer driven by compulsion. He claimed he had been driving home from work when he saw Christy stranded by the side of the road. According to his version, he stopped to help, offering her a ride to a convenience store. Once there, he said Cowan demanded money, threatening to accuse him of rape if he didn't hand it over. Smithers claimed that even after giving her all the cash he had, she threw a drink in his face. He told detectives that he snapped, grabbed an axe, and struck her once in the head, insisting she was still alive when he dragged her to the pond and left her there. It was a desperate attempt to rationalize a crime that defied reason. But the brutality of Cowan's injuries told another story, one that mirrored his earlier killing in terrifying detail. The same location, the same pattern of control, the same cold disposal of a human life. Christy Cowan's story, though, was not just one of tragedy, it was also one of lost potential. Her family later shared that Christy had once been full of promise. She had graduated high school at the top of her class, with dreams of becoming a nurse, a life dedicated to healing, not harm. But somewhere along the way, she fell into drug addiction, and the streets pulled her into a world she couldn't escape. Arrests for prostitution and drug use followed, and the woman who once dreamed of saving others was left fighting to save herself. By the time she met Samuel Smithers, Christy was struggling, but she was still someone's daughter, still a sister, still loved. And when investigators pulled her body from the pond, lying just feet from where Denise Roach had been found, one thing became undeniable. The man who preached in church halls and tended the gardens of faith had turned his sanctuary into a graveyard. The double life of Samuel Lee Smithers was no longer hidden. The mask of the deacon had slipped, revealing the darkness beneath. May 28, 1996. The Florida heat hung thick over Plant City, and the air carried a strange, metallic scent, blood, sweat, and something darker. On this day, Samuel Lee Smithers' double life, the church deacon and the killer, would finally collide. That evening, Marion Whitehurst, the owner of the quiet 27-acre property Smithers often used, arrived to find a disturbing scene. In the carport, Smithers was scrubbing an axe, its blade glinting wet in the light. On the concrete floor below him was a pool of blood, thick, dark, and unmistakably human. When she asked what had happened, Smithers barely flinched. "It's from an animal," he told her. But something about his calmness, the way he wiped the blade, the way he avoided her eyes, left her cold inside. Whitehurst's unease turned to dread, and soon after, she called the police. By the time detectives arrived, the blood had been washed away. But the ground told a story Smithers couldn't erase. Officers noticed drag marks through the grass, leading down a slope toward the pond at the edge of the property. Following the trail, they waded into the water, and what they found would unravel everything. Floating just beneath the surface was the body of a woman. She was later identified as Christy Elizabeth Cowan, the 31-year-old found the very same day she was killed. But the horror didn't end there. When divers searched deeper, they found a second body, tangled in weeds and mud, Denise Elaine Roach, missing for 2 weeks. The pond had become Smithers' secret graveyard. When Smithers was arrested that very day, the shock rippled through the community. This wasn't his first encounter with the law. Long before the killings, back in 1980, Smithers had been convicted of 3 separate church arsons in Tennessee, of all places, an unspeakable irony for a man who once claimed to serve God. At the time, he'd been working as a volunteer firefighter, the man people called for help when flames broke out. But Smithers had been the one lighting the matches. Now, 16 years later, he stood accused of something far worse, the brutal murders of 2 women, both lured, assaulted, and left to die in the same swampy pond. The autopsy results painted a horrifying picture. Christy Cowan had suffered multiple head wounds and skull fractures, injuries consistent with being struck by an axe. She also bore signs of strangulation and drowning, suggesting she was still alive when she was dumped in the water. Denise Roach had endured more than 10 stab wounds to her head, along with evidence of manual strangulation. It was clear, both women had died violent, deliberate deaths. On June 15, 1996, Smithers entered a plea of not guilty, and by July 4, prosecutors had announced they would seek the death penalty. After more than 2 years of preparation, Smithers finally went on trial on December 14, 1998, for the murders of Denise Roach and Christy Cowan. But the man who once confessed now changed his story completely. Taking the stand in his own defense, Smithers spun an elaborate tale of blackmail, drugs, and shadowy figures. He claimed that a mysterious man had threatened to show Smithers' wife a compromising photo of him with another woman unless he agreed to let the property be used for drug deals. According to Smithers, this same man, not him, had killed the 2 women. He said he had only helped dispose of their bodies, forced into silence by fear. In his testimony, Smithers described watching as the man struck Denise Roach with a hatchet, killing her instantly. He claimed he was then ordered to dump her body. Weeks later, he said, Cowan was murdered by another man, and again he was forced to clean up the aftermath. But there was one problem. No evidence supported his story. No witnesses. No photos. No mysterious accomplice. Just Smithers, and the undeniable trail of blood, drag marks, and death that pointed straight to him. For years, it seemed the story of Samuel Lee Smithers ended with the deaths of Denise Roach and Christy Cowan. But nearly 2 decades later, a chilling discovery would pull detectives back toward a third name, one that had been lost in old case files. In 2014, 18 years after Smithers' conviction, investigators began re-examining a cold case that had haunted Hillsborough County since the late 1980s, the unsolved murder of Marcelle Delano. Delano, a woman living on the margins, was last seen alive on November 27, 1989. Her body was found days later, brutally murdered, her case left without answers for more than 2 decades. When detectives revisited the evidence, one detail caught their attention: the location. Delano's body had been discovered just miles from the pond where Smithers dumped the bodies of Roach and Cowan. And the similarities didn't stop there. The method, the violence, the victim profile. It was all hauntingly familiar. By 2014, investigators believed that the 1989 murder wasn't random at all, that Marcelle Delano may have been Samuel Lee Smithers' first victim. Though Smithers denied any involvement, the parallels were too strong to ignore. He was officially named the prime suspect in the unsolved killing. But with no surviving forensic evidence strong enough to prove it in court, the case of Marcel Delano remains technically unsolved, a question mark on the long, dark trail Smithers left behind. Even from death row, Smithers refused to accept his fate quietly. He appealed his death sentence twice to the Florida Supreme Court. The first, on May 16, 2002, was denied. The second, on July 9, 2009, was dismissed. Still, he tried one last time. In March 2018, Smithers filed for post-conviction relief, claiming errors in his trial and sentencing. But once again, the courts were unmoved. The appeal was denied. For more than 25 years, the clock on Samuel Lee Smithers' death sentence kept ticking, slow, deliberate, and inevitable. On December 19, 1998, after hours of deliberation, a Hillsborough County jury returned its verdict. Guilty on 2 counts of first-degree murder. In early 1999, during the sentencing phase, Smithers' defense fought desperately to save his life. They called witnesses who described a lifetime of abuse and mental torment. His childhood was dissected before the court, stories of beatings, exorcisms, and head injuries were laid bare. His lawyers argued that he suffered from brain damage, mental illness, and religious repression that twisted his sense of right and wrong. Even his ex-wife, Sharon, the woman who had shared 23 years and a son with him, took the stand. Her voice trembled as she described the man she once knew. He was a good father, a good husband. I can't believe he could do something like this. But the jury saw through the mask that had fooled so many for so long. Behind the soft-spoken deacon and the doting father was a man who lit fires, first in churches, then in lives, until everything around him burned. The courtroom was silent on January 25, 1999, as the jury filed back into their seats, 12 faces that had spent weeks staring into the darkest corners of Samuel Lee Smithers' life. When the foreman spoke, there was no hesitation. We, the jury, recommend the death penalty for both counts of first-degree murder. The decision was unanimous. After hearing every detail, the brutality of the murders, the suffering of both women, the lies, the manipulations, the jury concluded there was no redemption left for the man once trusted as a deacon of faith. But even in that moment of finality, a single voice rose with compassion. Christy, Cowan's father, standing before the court, did not demand vengeance. Instead, he asked for mercy. "I don't want to see him die," he said quietly. "I want him to live, to spend the rest of his days in prison, and maybe find a way to repent. Maybe he can help others change before it's too late." It was a haunting contrast, the father of a victim offering grace to the man who had taken his daughter's life. Yet mercy would not prevail. On June 25, 1999, Circuit Judge William Fuente imposed the ultimate sentence. Looking down from the bench, he described the murders of Denise, Roach, and Christy Cowan as extremely torturous, acts carried out with deliberate cruelty. The gavel fell. Samuel Lee Smithers was sentenced to death. The man who once preached about salvation now faced eternity in the shadow of the electric chair, later replaced by lethal injection. For more than 2 decades, Smithers sat on Florida's death row, confined to a small concrete cell inside Union Correctional Institution. The world moved on. The families of his victims grew older. And Smithers, the former firefighter, church custodian, and convicted murderer, faded into the background of America's long list of forgotten death row inmates. But in September 2025, his name surfaced again. On September 13, 2025, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis signed Smithers' death warrant, setting his execution date for October 14, 2025, nearly 30 years after the murders that shattered Plant City. The countdown had begun. Smithers' attorneys launched a final desperate appeal, arguing that at 72 years old, their client was too old and frail to execute, that it would amount to cruel and unusual punishment. But the courts were unmoved. On September 26, Judge Michelle Cisco of Hillsborough County rejected the motion outright. Age, she ruled, does not excuse responsibility for the most heinous of crimes. Just 12 days later, on October 8, the Florida Supreme Court issued its final opinion, affirming that no precedent existed to shield elderly inmates from execution. Smithers' lawyers made one last plea, this time to the United States Supreme Court. It was denied just hours before his scheduled execution. The final curtain had fallen. For nearly 3 decades, Samuel Lee Smithers had lived in the limbo between judgment and justice. His crimes, savage, senseless, and steeped in contradiction, had haunted the small town of Plant City since that sweltering spring of 1996. He was the deacon who preached forgiveness but killed without mercy, the firefighter who started fires, and the husband who burned every bridge of redemption behind him. And as the clock ticked toward his execution, the world prepared to close the final chapter on a man who had spent a lifetime hiding behind faith while consumed by darkness. From the church pews of Plant City to the death chamber in Rayford, Samuel Lee Smithers' story is one of sin, secrecy, and the long shadow of justice. October 14, 2025. The sun rose slowly over Florida State Prison, pale light spilling through razor wire and watchtowers. Inside, Samuel Lee Smithers, now 72 years old, was awake before dawn. He had spent the night reading scripture and praying. When he was offered the traditional choice, a final meal, any food he wanted, he requested for fried chicken, fried fish, a baked potato, apple pie with vanilla ice cream, and a glass of sweet tea. It was a meal that could have come from any small-town diner in Florida, comforting, familiar, southern to its core. By late afternoon, the atmosphere inside the prison began to change. Inside the death chamber, the air was cold and sterile. A single gurney sat beneath the fluorescent lights, straps laid neatly across a clean white sheet. Smithers was led into the room. Witnesses said he looked older than his years, thin, pale, and tired. The decades had carved deep lines into his face. When asked for his final words, he declined. "No, sir," he replied. At exactly 6 p.m., the curtains opened. The warden gave the order. A saline solution began to flow, followed by the lethal injection, a sequence designed to still the body and silence the heart. Within minutes, Smithers' breathing slowed. His chest rose and fell one last time, and then stopped. At 6:15 p.m., a prison doctor entered, checked his pulse, and nodded. Time of death, 6:15 p.m., October 14, 2025. For the families, it wasn't about vengeance. It was about closure, about finally closing a chapter that had been open for nearly 3 decades. After many years, the case of Florida versus Samuel Lee Smithers was officially closed. That pond remains there today, calm, almost beautiful, holding the memories of 2 young women whose lives ended far too soon. Their stories might have faded with time, but today, justice wrote their names again. But after all these years, did justice truly prevail, or did the state simply take another life in the name of balance? Can any execution ever erase the pain left behind, or does it only echo it? Thank you for staying with me till the end of this video. If this story moved you, please share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear what you believe justice really means. And if you believe that every story deserves to be told, and every victim deserves to be remembered, please like this video, share it, and subscribe to the channel. Because some stories don't end with an execution. They live on in memory.